Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this year's Irish Institute lecture. A special welcome to the President of the Irish Institute and the trustees who are here today. Lovely to have you. My name is Peter Hession. I'm a faculty fellow in Irish history here in NYU, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Uxman Ireland House this evening. I would ask everybody if you have electronic devices to place them on silent if you can. Events like this are made possible by our membership here at Ireland House. So if anyone has any questions about membership or would like to join, please feel free to approach myself or my colleagues, Colin Delaney, or others here this evening. Okay, with that said, on to this evening's proceedings. It is a genuine pleasure for me to be able to introduce Dr. Seán Healy tonight. Seán is many things. Up until 2023, he was the CEO of Social Justice Ireland, which is the country's leading independent anti-poverty policy think tank, which he co-founded with Sister Bridget Reynolds in 2009. He holds a doctorate in sociology from the University of Fordham, just up the road. And while completing his doctorate there, I'm told he won the Irish State Marathon back in 1975. He's a man truly of many talents. But prior to all of that, he was also ordained a priest with the Society of African Missions and spent a decade working in West Africa before eventually returning to Ireland. It's really no exaggeration to say that after 40 years working on anti-poverty, social exclusion, public policy in Ireland, Seán is a household name back home. That's just a matter of fact. Particularly for those interested in social justice, but I would say in general, Seán is very well known. He is a fixture in many ways on the Irish scene. He's worked on many government task forces in Ireland and indeed internationally at EU level, with the European Council of Europe, with the OECD, and with the UN as well. And he's played a critical role in developing an ongoing dialogue really between the Irish government and the community and voluntary sector in Ireland. And I should say he's been something of a pioneer in that. He was appointed chair, for example, of the Irish government's task force on engaging communities with local government back in 2013. And to this day, he's still a member of the National Economic and Social Council of Ireland, which is a body which has been advising successive Irish Taoiseach, Prime Minister of Ireland, on critical issues of social and economic policy since 1973. Together with his collaborator, Sister Bridget Reynolds, Seán has published 43 books, I believe the quote is, or edited or written books, and also 3 books on spirituality for social engagement as well, separate to those on public policy. All of this makes Seán a person of unparalleled authority, insight, and perspective on questions of poverty and social policy in Ireland, looking back over a career of half a century. And of course, that's also a period during which Ireland experienced an immense amount of social and economic transformation. And Seán is going to reflect on his experiences for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to invite Q&A and have an audience discussion. Now Seán is looking forward to that. And then we're going to invite you, as customary, downstairs for some refreshments. So, without further ado, I will turn the mic over to Seán, Dr. Seán Healy.
Kevin, try and live up to that briefing or introduction or whatever. Putting this under these are my notes on the slides that I have here. And when I was here earlier, about half an hour ago, they suggested I should put it onto the computer here in case somebody might decide that they'd be a nice memento to take away when we started. But anyway, so first of all, a serious thank you for the invitation. I was delighted to accept it. And it is great to, always good to come back to New York, which I have done fairly regularly since I finished studying here. In fact, I'll just say here is I defended my PhD dissertation 41 years ago today. Wow. So 84. But so the timing is appropriate, like I was amused by the Earth Day Marathon as well, because of the fact that that was the first time I ever heard of Earth Day. So I got quite involved in Earth Day subsequently, and not just Earth Day, but you know, the issues around the environment and so on. So anyway, I want to say a special you as well before I start to a number of people whose work and research I have used quite extensively, and I'm not going to go start attributing it all as I go along. Micheál Collins in UCD, Dr. Micheál Collins, Dr. Catherine Kavanagh in UCC in Cork, Charles Clark, who is Dr. Professor in St. John's. Yes, he's the lead of the economics faculty at the moment. And I want to say a special word of thanks to Bridget Reynolds, with whom I have worked in one form or another for all, except for I think about 4 years of the last 54 years. So that's quite a long time. Okay. And she, like the ideas and so on that I'm going to be sharing, are all very much part of what we have worked on over our time. Let's see, no, just as I just said this timer. So one final comment before I really get started, and that is that it's only possible to cover a certain amount in 45 minutes, and that's all I'm going to do. I had an awful lot of work struggling to decide what I was going to cover and what I wasn't going to cover. So anyway, I made the decisions at this stage, obviously. So, but the one thing I would say is that on the Q&A, I'm quite prepared to respond to any questions on any, not necessarily just the issues I've spoken about. If I know nothing about whatever you've asked, I'll tell you straight out, and there'll be some problem with that. So, what I want to do then is to take a look at some significant changes over the 50 years. So set the context and those kinds of things, reminding you stuff. Much of this you probably are aware of, but maybe not all of it. And then I want to share a number of key insights that I've gained, that I was gained over the last 50 years. So we get started. Some significant changes. Ireland has changed dramatically. At one level, there's probably no need to make that point here. At the same time, I think the numbers are quite surprising when you stop and look at them. In 50 years ago, Ireland's population was 3 million, just over 3 million, 3.07. Today it's 5.2 million. That is an incredible. But population has gone up an additional 2/3 over that period. Household disposable income was at that time not much more than $50 a household per week. Today it's over about $1,150 a week. So again, huge changes over the period. In that period, we also joined what was then the European Economic Community, which is the European Union today. And in reality, what we saw was a poor country became a rich country. GDP and GDP per capita grew dramatically. So one point I just made in passing, I'll come back to it, is that despite the growth and despite the richness and so on, it has remained very clear that there is a huge need for a voice for those with least, and that is a critically important issue. So, other changes, life expectancy went from 71 to 82.9 over the same period. We've now in a situation where year after year, Ireland is very close to full employment, but it's technically full employment. And we've also seen a huge increase in the female labour force, which maybe was responsible for a lot of the sort of surge that happened at the start of the 90s. And exports are interesting. We went from $1 billion a year in exports to 208 billion, which is our current number. Okay, so give us again the kinds of things that are happening. So one of the things I want to talk about or start focusing on is the issue of disposable income. Now, when I'm talking about disposable income, what I'm talking about is income after earnings and welfare transfers, and less the income tax. So basically, people get paid whatever they get paid. All the welfare is paid out, all the taxes are deducted. What people have then disposable, that's their disposable income. And they use it in a variety of different ways. So it basically is what people have to spend. So taking a look then, starting at that point, because this is the kind of work that we have done consistently. What we find is that the income pie has grown hugely over time. But the issue is its distribution. There are serious questions about whether it's fair, whether it's more unequal, or have we had a situation where there hasn't been that much change? I want to look at the evidence in a minute. And I think, interestingly enough, households and their income, rather than individuals and their income, were a lot of the focus for a long time, basically because that was where the data was, and it was pursuing that. Now, I don't have too many tables like this, so I know some people run away from tables, but just for a second, what we're looking at here is the distribution of household disposable income, all the way from 73 to 2022, so over 50 years plus, or just on 50 years, sorry. And then these are selected years. But interestingly enough, if you look at what I've put together here, or what I've highlighted out in red within the boxes are the top 2 deciles and the bottom 2 deciles. So in other words, the bottom 2 deciles are at the top of the table, just to be causing confusion. But basically, you put it's basically a quintile of 20%. And if you look at 1973, it's the bottom decile had 1.7% of all the income. Second, 3.3. You put it together, it's 5% of the total income, disposable income in the country. When you go all the way over to 2022, we have a situation where the poorest quintile has gone from having 5% of all the money available to now it is 5.7%. So that's the huge change that is happening. Huge, it isn't. It's actually quite small. Okay. At the other end, there's a slight difference. The top, well, this is the top 20%. They have gone from 42.6%, almost half, is to the top 20%. It's gone from 42.6 to 42.3. So like it's a minuscule change, and I think that's important. Much easier maybe to look at it this way. Graph tells the story. And at the top we have the high income people, the top 20%, and you see all the time, quite straight, small bits and pieces of changes. The bottom 20% more or less stuck at the same level all the time. That's why we do. So now these are the same numbers as in the graph, but in the graph format to try and understand it maybe a little bit better. But very little change has happened. Now, these are all households. So we take you can then change this data nowadays. It's much easier to do because this data is collected and dealt with much better, much more detail. And what we can now look at is the actual equivalized disposal. This is pulling it out for individuals. And note the difference. There's almost no difference. Slight, but not an awful lot. Okay. So what this does in effect is it adjusts for the number of people in each of the households that we were talking about earlier on. Okay? So if we're looking at the whole issue of income distribution and equality, or inequality, the thing to look at is the Gini coefficient. Now, the Gini coefficient measures from 0 to the results would be somewhere between 0 and 100. 100. The higher the number, the greater the level of inequality. The less inequality you have, the more inequality that number gets lower. So you can track the level of the trend over time. There have been two sources, the ESRI and the Central Statistics Office. And they use very slightly different methodologies, but come more or less to the same conclusion. And what you find is a little bit of a change, if you like, a little bit of an improvement, but not a huge amount. When you basically go back to the point I made that a poor country became rich, it didn't actually dedicate a huge amount of the additional resources to reducing poverty and inequality. Okay? And at the same time, it's kind of important to acknowledge the pluses that are there, because there is a bit of a change. And look at the difference. When you look at other countries, the thing I would draw your attention to here is that the other English-speaking countries all wind up, with the exception of the UK, all wind up with an increase in their Gini coefficient. Their inequality increased since the mid-90s when we have the data that we can compare them all. There's others as well, but the significant thing for me is that in the English-speaking world, most of the countries have gone in the opposite direction, increasing inequality. So I suppose there's an issue to be, or an acknowledgement to be made that there has been some progress. And even if the reduction in the Gini is very slight, it's still an improvement on where it was. Now, let's move on to focus. I've been looking at inequality really. I haven't been looking at, because I haven't said anything about where a poverty line is or what the numbers of poverty are. That's a separate issue, because you could have huge divisions and still nobody in poverty, which of course is not the case in practice. But anyway, I want to take a look at poverty. Over the 50 years that I'm looking at, there's the thing that kind of surprised me in a way when I saw it first, and then of course it doesn't surprise me at all, and that is that there's waves of poverty. And in the past 50 years, we've always had poverty between 13 and 20% of the population, but there's been a downward trajectory. It's going down, but slowly. However, there's an interesting pattern that poverty rises as the economy strengthens. So the economy gets improves, and then there's sort of, we forget about poor people, they should be doing okay, they should get jobs or whatever the story may be. Employment and wage growth, there is improving when there's periods of improved employment and improved wage growth, then there's also probably income tax reductions, and what you find is poorer households wind up slipping behind. They're forgotten about. Then things get rougher again, and then suddenly they're remembered, and there's an improvement, and there's a period of catch-up. And that, I suppose, the catch-up is driven by in great volume by the people who actually campaign very much for this to happen, to actually reduce poverty. So I suppose in one level, we have still need in Ireland for voices that argue for solidarity in Irish society and so on. But what we have is a cycle that repeats itself. Poverty reduces in tough times, the economy improves, poverty rises. There's something, I would suggest there's something wrong with that we should be able to deal with that in a better way, okay? Poverty remained consistently high, and there remains then a need for the voice of those with the least. So if you're looking at the actual numbers, here's the picture. Relative income poverty in Ireland. This covers the period from 73 all the way through to 23. These are all percentages. Okay? So you see the actual slide slowly. But my own view would be that we could have done a lot more if we were really prioritizing poverty reduction instead of just giving it rhetorical support or whatever. So interestingly enough, let's take a look at that same issue of the relative income poverty. But instead of looking at percentages, let's look at the numbers of people, right? Because the population grew. You have a very interesting situation here. So at the beginning, in 1994, which is the first time that we have serious numbers that we can use, and all using the same methodology that's used today, what you find there's the green line. And in 94, there were 559, just on 560,000 people in poverty in Ireland. 560,000. The most recent year, 2002, when your numbers were, it's gone up to 668,000. So it's interesting. That's almost 670,000. So population is growing, absolutely. But the numbers living in poverty in Ireland went from 560,000 up to 670,000. Now that's a factor, obviously, of growing population. But there's also an issue about at a policy level that did not have to happen. It happened because of decisions that we made as countries, and the decisions prioritize other things and not this particular issue. Another interesting thing that we need to be careful about, particularly in the Irish context, because I think this is important for us, might be important for others as well. But if you look at the period in this century, from 2001 to the present time, what I'm highlighting in the next slide is the importance of welfare in reducing poverty. If welfare was not in place, we would have poverty on the black line. But as an actual fact, it's on the green line. And if you look at where the situation was, after the crash of 2008-9, so in 10-11, you get this period where over 50% of the population would have been living in poverty. That's with incomes below the poverty line, based on the disposable income people had, would have been over 50%, except for the welfare payment, which brought the poverty rate down quite dramatically. So I think that's important in that context, just to bear that in mind when we're talking about policy as well. So an overall comment then on inequality and poverty overall. Over the 50 years, there isn't, on income distribution and inequality, there's not much change at the headline level. There's an obvious redistribution effect ongoing, especially addressing inequity in earnings and market incomes. People are earning more. But at the same time, Ireland has joined continental Europe on inequality, from being number 2 in inequality in the Western world, behind the United States. I could produce, these are the kinds of things I could have produced all these numbers, but there's really so much to do. But in actual fact, we were number 2 in terms of inequality behind the USA. But over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've been slowly but surely moving in the direction of joining the continental Europeans in that space. Again, I would be critical of the fact that we haven't done nearly enough in that area, but at least we were going a bit in the right direction. I think partly caused by the people who were lobbying about it as well, if I might say so myself. That would be an observation by a lot of people, not just by myself. So on poverty, there's a downward trend, but there's waves of change. So the darn thing gets reversed again all the time. And you then go up and down and up and down. Gradually going down, but not on the scale that could have been done, and I believe ought to have been done. And we still need ought to be done. There's a big job still to be done. There's a key role for welfare payments to support the living standards of those at the bottom of the income distribution. I think it's very important in that context. And it's interesting, as I've said already, that Ireland did not follow the rise in poverty in Anglo-American countries, English-speaking world. So Interesting point in the context of things that are happening at the moment and the interpretation of them. I think it's useful to look at the underlying development model that Ireland has followed. And from at the early 1980s, President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher were promoting globalization. This was the great solution to what was, as they saw it, not going well in the economies of the world and in the societies generally. So, of course, they didn't always believe, certainly Thatcher didn't believe there was such a thing as society, but that's another day's work. She said that. So, but what we got was a proposal from them, very strong, on globalization, and that would basically involve much manufacturing would be done in poorer countries, while services would underpin the better off. And Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and many others and conservatives and liberals all agreed with this transition. Ireland, in fact, acted on the proposed approach to the development view of globalization very strongly. And we have one of the most open, if not the most open, but certainly one of the most open economies in the world as a result. Okay. And that one of the things that has done to Ireland is that we have a huge surplus in manufacturing with our engagement on manufacturing with the US. So we're doing extremely well with that. Interestingly enough, when these numbers are compared so much in the media these days, I find it interesting that services are omitted. The deal was that manufacturing would move out, not all, but a lot of it that could be done more cheaply with people who paid less in poorer countries and so on. And Ireland qualified in that space. And it would be replaced by services. And the result, of course, is that when you look at Ireland and the United States today, Ireland has a huge deficit compared in its relationship with the United States. The United States has a huge surplus on services. So if you want to talk about the economy, I would have thought you should put manufacturing and services together. And then when you put the two of them together, Ireland and the US more or less even out, balance out. Okay. So much, so I think that's important to bear in mind. And also one of the things about the profits that needs to be noted that isn't picked up much is that a lot of the profits that are made in places like Ireland, particularly in Ireland, President and track it a fair bit, much of the profits from that manufacturing is actually redirected to the United States. But maybe that's stuff that we want to talk about later, or that's stuff maybe for another day or another month or year a discussion. But anyway, so to move on to the second half of what I want to say.
In a lot more than 45 minutes.
So I'm going to put out 5 key insights. I do have a few more than the 5, but I had to limit it again with time. The first and the fifth one I will spend a little bit more time. Okay? The first one is how change happens. I think it's very, very important that people understand how change happens. And a lot of the time, people don't. Now, when we're talking about generating change or how change happens, one of the things that we have to get our hands on is core meaning. That in every society, like in any organization or whatever, there are a series of competing core meanings. I'll come back to the exact detail of what I mean by that in a moment. The core meaning, what I mean by that. But in any society, there are competing core meanings and there's a dominant core. Okay? And the dominant core meaning is the key. Changing the dominant core meaning for me is the key to generating change. And if we want to change the realities that we've been talking about and things that need change, that's what we need to be thinking of. So, how change happens, key elements in core meaning. It seems to me that in core meaning, there's an underlying, maybe often not referred to very much, understanding of the way things are. Understand? And there's a vision or an idea of where we ought to go or where we want to go or where we are going. And we make decisions based on those two. We're moving from where we understand things to be towards where we think they ought to be. Okay, and so we've always called this, Bridget Reynolds and I, we've called it our simple ABC. So when you're looking at change, you're always asking, like, how do these people, how does this group, how does this society understand the present? How does it envision the future? And then what's it doing to move from one to the other? And the three are absolutely locked together, because the action will depend on the A, the understanding of the present, the vision of the future. Everybody has their own core meaning, by the way. I'm not going to do it now, but if you want to give it a little time yourself sometime, ask yourself a simple question. Why do you get up in the morning? Underpinning, whether you realize it or not, underpinning you getting out of bed in the morning is an understanding of the present and a vision of the future. You're getting up to move from one to the other, or to move from one to the other. But we could discuss that, I'm sure. What are the carriers of meaning? What main carriers of meaning in society are education, mass media, and religion. And they basically, a lot of the time, are telling us this is the way things are, this is the way things ought to be, this is why you need to do X, Y, Z. You stand back and look at media, whatever. I think that's what you're looking at. Okay, but that's not the same as saying that there is no understanding on either one of those, the A or B. There is an actual understanding. And it's very important to name it, because a lot of the time it might not be accurate. So if you're generating change, it seems to me, if you want to generate change, the key to it is in changing the meaning. The core meaning, dominant core meaning. The A and the B. Changing the way people understand the present, or changing the way people understand the vision, their vision of the future, where we ought to go. And then it's a question of, you can change one or the other, or both. Okay? And what that does, you make decisions based on that new understanding. Those decisions are about your resources and how you redistribute resources, or how you distribute resources in the first place, are the kind of key to understanding the relationships we have. Because we engage with people who are close to our own kind of levels of income, understandings, and so on. Okay, so in academic terms, you'll be talking about culture. That's the A and the B and the C. That understanding of culture, not high culture, and it's a new vision of the future, possibly, that is providing the energy to do the political organizing, and the political organizing is targeted at changing the economic distribution, which in turn leads to new social structures, new social relationships. Now, there's an awful lot of stuff in there, which I'm not going to go into anymore. Because there's a note for now, we talk about it later if people are interested. That's my first thing about understanding how that happens. If people don't understand that, then a lot of the time they're kind of engaging in social change without understanding it, without knowing it a lot of the time. And certainly trying to change it, then they will not be on the at the races on what needs to be done. The second deep insight is that economics is not chemistry. Now, this took me a while, right? But anyway, in reality, over the years, I have seen economics gain the status of a new religion, but not quite, but almost. Okay, it was the basis. And is the basis in much the way by which most progress is measured. Not by everybody and not even by all economists, but in the overall scheme of things, when people want to know what is progressing or whether they're progressing, they revert to economic measures, as if that were the only part that matters in terms of progress. And economics has its own high priesthood, which are basically the kind of people that in the commentariat that I say, people who head up major economic organizations or whatever the issue may be. But basically, I think we've had a situation, certainly it's been true of Ireland, where when Ireland wants to know whether it's making progress or not, it usually asks economists. It has a set of economists that it will ask, not many others. And as Peter said earlier on, sometimes it's very, very difficult to get a different voice here. Okay. But actually, economics is not a natural science. It's not like chemistry. Like you do an experiment in chemistry, you'll get the same result wherever you do. That's not economics. Economics isn't that kind. So, well, I would be basically arguing that there's far too narrow a basis to underpin progress. So I'm saying the second, third, and fourth insights and keeping them tight because we have only so much time. I'm happy to develop any of this later with Q&A if people are interested. Third insight that I highlight is that dialogue is essential. And when I talk about dialogue, I'm talking about speaking and listening. Because in a dialogue situation, everybody has the right to speak, but everybody has the obligation to listen as well. So in Ireland, we ourselves were very involved. This is Social Justice Ireland. We were very involved over the years in our previous incarnation before we became Social Justice Ireland in 2009. And we went back quite a distance. We were involved in social partnership. Social partnership is a process in Ireland in which key sectors were brought together by government to dialogue with government, employers, farmers, trade unions, community and voluntary sector. The voluntary sector are the NGOs or the non-profit sector, whatever you want to call it, very involved. NGOs very involved in provision of services. Very interesting thing. We negotiated national agreements together with government and those other representative organizations in those other sectors for more than 20 years. And in that time, Ireland changed. And the context of the engagement changed and led to improved economic growth, improved incomes, improved education, improved healthcare, and reduced marginalization, exclusion. There was also almost no labor strikes in that whole period of over 20 years. And one of my key things is that the dialogue always meant that people could raise the issues that concern them, which were then engaged with by the other participants, including government. At the end of the day, you couldn't force government to do something, but you could put a lot of pressure on them. But at the end of the day, it isn't about actors taking power away, taking government's decision making away from it. No, but it means that government makes a lot more informed decisions based on a lot better analysis and understanding of what the core meaning and so on is one of the key things I discovered myself about being involved in these kinds of processes is that there is a kind of I have it down here in the last line. There's kind of a key understanding that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that was our experience. Prior to these, like there would be decisions made by government, and a lot of the time, things that were important for poor people or excluded people or marginalized people or whatever, they would not be looked after. Or they would even lose some of the things that they had put on the menu. Subsequently, during this 20-year period, plus everything that changed, basically because you had the capacity to be as loud and as engaged and as seen as others in that process. Now, it broke down again after the crash about a decade and a half ago. And the new government that came in under Andy Kenny in 2011 and has continued in one form or another since has been very negative about sharing what it sees as sharing power with other actors, whether they're employers or trade unions or whatever. And it tends to revert back to a traditional understanding that the only people that ought to be involved should be involved are employers and trade unions, nobody else. With all due respects, that's just putting a lot of other people on the menu. And that's what's been happening. Happy to discuss that and so. If people are interested in that, further as well later. An issue that concerns me is that, and out of it comes this insight that government commitment matters. An awful lot of people are coming to the conclusion that government doesn't matter. That this does continue anyway. It isn't, that isn't true. Government commitment is very important, government engagement. Okay, and we ourselves in Social Justice Ireland played a big role in changing, this is during the 90s, and we changed government's understanding of the A and B over a period of time, not over 5 minutes, over a period of time. And as a result, they understood, the government came to understand that their understanding was of the way things were, was not quite accurate. But more importantly, they came to understand that vision of the future wasn't really what didn't measure up to what they would talk about, you know. So, and we convinced them that to get closer to it, they needed to sort of engage with people who were depending on government payments. And as a result, those payments rose dramatically over a period of 3 years that we convinced them to go with this. And as a result, there was an increase of €51 a week on single people now. And it had a big impact on the way that people engage because they had more money. But more importantly, it also made it much better for them in a difficult situation subsequently when the crash came in 2009 and Ireland went into it. That wasn't to do with the World Bank and the IMF and so on. It meant that Ireland's poorest was not in as bad a position as they would otherwise have been. So it was a big impact on poor people post-crash, post the 2008-9 crash. So the pointed issue here is about engaging government, and government commitment does matter. I think there's a lot of other nuances in that possibly different ideas about, but I think it's just important not to come to the conclusion that government doesn't matter. It does big time. Finally, my fifth insight has to do with universal basic income. Now, this is where I wonder, I can take a lot more than 45 minutes. Where to start? It's very simple, it seems to me, to think in terms of where we're going as a planet. And what I'm talking about basically is we have a system across the whole planet at this point where people have to get access to money to be able to purchase what they need to live with dignity, or whatever they can do. They need money, but to get the money, they must have a paid job. That's our agreed system for income distribution. The problem we're facing, and I think it's coming hurtling at us, although we're not actually paying much attention, is that we're not going to be able to produce enough decent jobs for people who want across our planet. Now, that's interesting because people have a right to work. In fact, a lot of people would say they have a responsibility to work. So how does this, what are we going to do? Are we just going to get rid of people, or are we just going to let them strike like with nobody, or what? Okay, and it seems to me that we need a kind of a fundamental rethink of the whole issue of work. But you can't do it on alone, you have to come with other things as well, which I'll come to in a second, which is where the income comes in. But I think we've got to face a situation where people will not have a paid job guaranteed, but they will want to work. So we need, I think, to understand work differently. At the moment, if you ask somebody, what do you work at? How does the person hear that? They hear it as, what job do you have? Where are you employed? Okay, but in actual fact, that's not the question. I was asking, that's, what do you work at? There's a whole, the meaning of work isn't just a paid job. There's a whole lot of other stuff. Okay, so there's a whole lot of work that is done by people who are not paid for that work. And if you don't believe that, I just always say, ask anyone who's going to carry so much of the unpaid work in our work. Yet we need to realize that the society and the world we live in needs to understand that there's more to work than a paid job. And if we can't provide paid jobs for everybody, we need to recognize those other types of work. So I would say what should work be understood is anything that contributes to the development of, to my own development, the development of the household, community, the wider world. Anything that contributes to development should be seen, positive development should be seen as meaningful work. And then we could have a situation where everybody has meaningful work. But there's a problem. Problem is obvious. If at the moment, this is how people access paid jobs, this is how they access money. How do they access money if there isn't a paid job? Then the data will follow. And that problem, people like me are advocating, or we're advocating, is the introduction of universal basic income. Universal basic income is a proposal where government provides a regular, unconditional cash payment to every citizen. Okay. Regardless of their income or their employment status. So, person has a job, they get the basic income. Person's unemployed, they get the basic income. Whether they're unemployed or employed or whatever, they get the basic income. Now, this payment is intended to be sufficient for basic living needs, if not in any sense extravagant, and it's not means tested or tied to any work requirement. Okay. Now, it means, of course, that it will wind up replacing other acts that people have, because the whole welfare system that we have would disappear with one exception, which is people in situations where there's an additional cost for they have a disability or they're old or whatever the situation. That would make a difference. Absolutely. So in Ireland, we proposed the introduction of the universal basic income in the 1980s. And studies have been done, a lot of them driven by ourselves, but they were done independently. And I referred to Professor Charles from John's University, St. John's. He's done a lot of work on Ireland and other countries on the costings of use beyond basic income, but lots of others have as well. And those studies have been done since the 1990s. In 2002, the Irish government published a green paper, which is basically a mechanism used in democracies like Ireland and UK, where government will publish a paper of what they believe is the possibility or the possibilities of a particular approach. They can say this will work, this won't work, or with this adjustment or that adjustment, or whatever. And the Irish government published a green paper on universal basic income in 2002 and basically concluded that it was possible. But ever since that time, there's been a lot of studies on it and probably costs and so on, but there's been constant resistance from three key groups: from civil servants, some civil servants, not all, some civil servants, some politicians, and some academics. But interestingly enough, the resistance is not based on evidence. It's ideological. It's saying basically, if you do this, you destroy society or whatever. Now, the evidence, there's no evidence for that, but that doesn't mean that people don't hold it. Interestingly enough, in Ireland, there is a pilot which the last government started to introduce a basic income for artists. And there's 3,000 artists on a 3-year pilot program. They're on the 3rd year. And it's going very well. it will certainly come out as the evaluation will be positive. The tragedy is that the amount they're paying the artists is too much in the context of whether the same amount could be paid to everybody in society in Ireland. But if they could have done they've done a slightly different pilot and kept the money at a level that society could the economy could afford. They decided not to do that. With my Machiavellian mind, I'm convinced that that was not an accident. So you wind up piloting something that you can't win, you know what I mean? So anyway, we are where we are. So he basically, why is basic income so important? Why do I see it as so important? So here's a quick list. It's very friendly to work and very friendly to employment. So it makes all sorts of things possible that we're not otherwise popular. It eliminates poverty traps and unemployment traps. You know, the situation that if you move from unemployment to a job and you wind up losing money, there's a trap that people are not obviously going to be too enthusiastic about going that route. Basic income eliminates that. It eliminates poverty trap. It promotes equity and ensures that everyone receiving it at least receiving the least the poverty threshold level of income. So they get at least that amount, not a huge amount of money, but makes a huge difference. It spreads the burden of taxation more equitably because everybody winds up paying tax. You pay tax from the first penny you earn. You get your basic income in lieu of what your tax breaks were previous. All right. And it treats men and women equally. Men and women both receive it in their own right. You know, sort of channeling it through anything, households or whatever. It is simple and it's transparent, which is always true of government programs or public programs generally. It's efficient in labour market terms. It rewards types of work in the social economy that the market economy often ignores, things like home duties or caring for older people, caring for children, caring for people with disabilities. Many of which positions are not remunerated in any way. People have to carry the costs themselves, and very often don't have the people to do so. It faces up to the changes in the global economy because the economy is like the same at the beginning. The situation where we won't have jobs for everybody, pay jobs for everybody. That looks for them. And it also really resolves core environmental challenges of our time. Now, one thing, there is a kind of a right-wing, what I would call, maybe it's not fair to say right-wing, but it's kind of coming from Silicon Valley type thinkers who basically think that, okay, they realize there's going to be a lot of job losses with AI and stuff. So what they do is they're basically saying, okay, we've got to solve it with basic income. But then they want to say, okay, people can pay it, and then once they get their basic income, we can forget about it. We would not accept that because we would say if you have universal basic income, it's also universal basic services. We must have health and education levels. It makes us think that completely. So, a minute over time. Overall, things that I think might try to say that change is constant and it's challenging. I think everybody, resistance to change is also constant and challenging. And we've got to remember that. Understanding how change happens is crucial. And I think that's one of the missing blocks in what we need in trying to build a big for the future. Economics is not chemistry, just to remember that. Okay. So lots of other things need to be involved in measuring progress and stuff. And let's get rid of the high priesthood. Just to make that point. Dialogue is essential. Government commitment matters, and the rest of basic income is key to the future. That's as I see it. Thank you very much.
Q&A now, I'm going to be roaming around with the mic, so.
Yeah, question back here.
This is a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. And the question is,
Not well. Let's put it that way. There has been a constant resistance in Ireland to accepting that there are issues around the provision of accommodation. And we now, with the growing population, we have a situation where we are hundreds of thousands of accommodation units short of just basic provision. So what that has done, it's very good for people who have a lot of or wealthy or whatever, who have a lot of property, because the cost of houses has gone, well, cost of all things, apartments, has gone through the roof and is continuing to rise. And now you have a situation where the latest generation don't see it as possible for them to purchase their own property. And that's the first time in Irish history, in modern times, last century, that has been the case. There's up to relatively recently, it was always an assumption that by the time you got to retirement, you either owned your property or you had social housing that was being provided by government. And as a result, we built our whole pension system and so on the understanding that they did not have to pay rent in any serious way after their retirement. Now we're facing a new reality, and as usual, doing nothing about it, except doing a lot of running around in circles, you know, appointing more and more commissions and having endless arguments about how do you count houses. Huge problem. The Ireland's a big place, you know. Count the number of houses. Unfortunately, we count the number of houses. We have it all registered. We do censuses every 10 years, all this kind of stuff. Everybody's addresses are all that sort of stuff. So we have a growing homelessness problem, and we have a big failure on the issue of accommodation and providing accommodation, and we are not dealing with it in any effective or serious way. I myself believe it will be one of the two main issues that government will have to deal with in the coming years. And I think if this government doesn't deal particularly with the housing issue, it'll pay a huge price at the next general election. The other issue, by the way, is the environment.
Your statistics seem to show that over the last 50 years, the percentage of people living in poverty as sort of as a percentage is fairly stable. Is UBI the key to finally reducing the percentage, or is it the key to preventing the disaster that will come when less jobs will be available with automation and all that?
Okay. One thing I keep warning people is not to try and attribute everything to UBI. Because some people believe it can produce all sorts of magic. I don't believe that to be true. What it can do is ensure that everybody has an income, and it can ensure that that is sufficient to live life with dignity. Now that's not 3 holidays a year abroad or anything like that. It's basically, we're talking about basics, okay? But at the moment, the poverty line is not hugely high, and it would be possible. The state pays a basic welfare rate for people who are unemployed. We've always worked on the assumption that the research has looked at what would it mean if everybody had that money as a basic, everybody, not just unemployed. And so it's not going to be hugely high, but it would make a huge difference, particularly to people on the margin. It's not going to make an awful lot of difference to people with higher incomes. This one is small money by their standards. But for people who have little or nothing, it's a huge amount. So therefore, what you have to do to make basic income work in terms of eliminating poverty altogether would be to set it at poverty level. But you don't have to, you can have a very effective basic income. system without actually reaching that level. Okay, remember, if you have a basic income, you can still go out, you get your basic income and it's untaxed. But you can go out and earn a job, and get a job and earn some more. And you can do that part-time or full-time, whatever you like. And okay, you pay tax on that, but it means that every time, every hour you work, you have an extra, you get more money. You don't wind up in all these kinds of traps that tax systems have and so on.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation, with a lot of data. One thing that I'm wondering about with regard to poverty levels, what has been the effect of net immigration with Ireland becoming presumably an increasingly attractive destination for immigrants? And also, how does the homelessness problem reflect any rise in immigration? Thank you.
Okay. I think it's important to understand the role migration plays in Ireland and has played. If we didn't have the level of migration that we have, we would not have grown economically. A huge number of migrants coming to Ireland into specific jobs that pay very well. What we're doing in effect is sort of creeping up an awful lot of people from Asia and from other parts of Europe, because we have so much of these big players in terms of artificial intelligence and various other pieces, new computers, a lot of the capacity to work these things. So the vast majority of migrants in Ireland make a huge contribution to the country. And that's important to understand. The level of migration, that is, people looking for, that they're leaving their country under pressure. We've had certain amounts of waves of that, most recent being Ukrainian, and there's 114,000 Ukrainians in Ireland, and Ireland made a special provision for Ukrainians. And not all of those Ukrainians are in government programs. A lot of them are actually working. A lot of them were able to put jobs, not necessarily in their own area, but in areas that they were capable of working in and they were able to access. And also they have some of those Ukrainians are going back to Ukraine. Okay, but we have a steady stream of migrants who are coming in from different places. And the most challenging is coming out of Africa, because an awful lot of the migrants from Africa are leaving places where their land has been destroyed, it's barren, it's found desert, or it's flooded, and this isn't just a problem for Ireland, it's a problem for the rest of the world. Because we have a planet where the population is growing, but where we are destroying the planet in different ways. We use the short term that the planet's on fire, California will probably have the appreciation of the fact that at times it literally is on fire next door. But the reality is that we need to adjust for carbon, we need to adjust our pollution, and that we know what we have to do. Okay, and if we want to deal with the issues of migration, then we have to deal with what is causing that migration. Okay? So Ireland makes a serious effort that for the what I call it, we call it ODA, official development assistance. The assistance for those poor countries, and most of our development is focused on Africa. Now, Ireland was not a colonizing country, but the colonizer in all except one of the African countries was our European Union. Sorry, not anymore. Britain was the European Union. But the exception of the country that's an exception is Liberia, which was USA. Irish no over. So it makes a sense, if you like, for us to focus on Africa, and we're putting a lot of money in there. And we're putting a lot of programs in there and trying to get those countries to make their decisions and stuff. Like perhaps consistent with the environment protection, things of that nature. And we have pressure in some places in Ireland, but there hasn't been like that pressure, that the migration issue has not been a huge issue. I think it's clear enough from the fact that the level of support for sort of politicizing it or whatever in the Irish context is like very, very small. It's 1 or 2%. So in that sense, there isn't a huge movement around migrants that you see in some other countries. But that doesn't justify complacency of that nature. We have to deal with it, and I think we have to deal with it now straight. And you think that part of the situation, go back to my ABC. Well, we need an accurate analysis of what the situation is all the time, and we need some vision of the future. It's not good enough, I think, just to throw people out and say, well, you go work it out. It's not our problem. We are contributing to that, to the problem that we deal with, however later, and we're not doing enough. None of us are doing enough to deal with it. So it fits into my wider kind of understanding of coordinating and trying to get people to see and get a new understanding of the things really are, and what the future might be, where's the destination, and then we're in a position to make better initiatives on the ABC, what we actually do.
Thank you. This is wonderful. So I had a question that sounds like an economics question, but I mean it to be sociological. So if you overlay the decline in unemployment, which in the 90s was mid-teens, over the poverty level lines, you would have seen the unemployment lines coming down, as you said in your opening statement, that there's effectively full employment. Why has the poverty levels stayed so high, given the fact that unemployment has come down so dramatically? And there are a number of sociological reasons one could imagine, like single family or single parent household formation, things like that. Could you comment on that, please?
Okay, of course. Not much of it is caused by single family, single parent family formation. And much of it is basically in that piece that I talked about, waves of poverty. What actually happens is, you can see it right now. Ireland is close to full employment and poverty is rising. Now that's nuts if you're serious about policy. The problem is, because it's close to full employment, a lot of politicians and policymakers revert to what I want to put into inverted commas as an understanding of the way things are. So therefore they come to the false understanding that everybody can access a job, so therefore they should all get a job and fit this nonsense, and we won't increase welfare. We'll encourage them to go and take up a job. So they follow through on that old adage about if you want to get the poor to work, take up a job, you pay them less, pay their work their less or whatever, you get them to work and take up a job. If you want better off to work, you pay them more. Very interesting. What we have done over and over again is once we get close to full employment, we say, oh, mission accomplished, that's fine. Right? Except it's not. It's the moment, like this is the moment that we should be reducing poverty dramatically. We have the resources to do it. We are hugely in surplus. Now, some of that is transfer pricing and all that stuff that we've been hearing a huge amount about recently, that we've been writing about for 20 years or more, 25 years, trying to get the government to deal with the stuff. And basically warning that there will come a time when people cop onto the way they're actually making their money, and that there will be a strong strike back. But anyway, the bottom line of it is we have the resources to deal with the problem. There's two keys. One is that jobs should be paid a decent wage. There's an awful lot of poorly paid jobs in Ireland. An awful. And there's a study out on it yesterday from the ESRI, basically looking at the levels of jobs being advertised at the minimum wage, not above. You know? And we've been running a campaign for years, and we're getting places in trying to get the minimum wage moved to the living wage. And we set up a group, where we were part of the group, we're set up to calculate what the living wage should be. And now the last government decided, yeah, they adopt the living wage as the target, that the minimum wage would be the living wage. But now they're trying to roll back on it. The new government is trying to roll back a bit and say, we'll slow it down, because we have all this kind of stuff. But it's the same story. You stand back and you look at waves of poverty, things don't change.
Thank you for your presentation. It's about the universal basic income, or my question would be is about the fact that would we not need to prioritize first maybe fighting, well not fighting, but considering the question of, goes back to the first question I was asked for you about homelessness, and what would be about capital and ownership inheritance? Because you see a concentration of ownership and capital in all of the Western countries. You have Piketty, which has already seen that in France, the UK, and the US, ownership is comparable to that of pre-revolution in the 1700s. And in Ireland, where I'm from, the same people, the same businesses, and all the rental households in the 60s, the same families who've been inheriting it, and they raise the rent up much faster than income. So if combating inheritance inequality would that not need to go before universal basic income?
I would say no. But let me explain. First of all, clarify something. The problem we have with housing is interesting, because Ireland built far more houses every year. We were a really poor nation in the 40s and 50s, particularly in the 50s and early 60s. We were building far more houses, and we were eliminating tenements, all that sort of thing. And in this place, we were getting something. People are very serious, why they need them. The housing situation, and what actually happened to mean that we actually went from a situation where we were building more than enough houses all the time when we were a poor country, to not building nearly enough as we were a rich country. And I can tell you exactly where it happened. It happened when we decided that houses were not homes, but were tradable commodities. And from that moment on, housing became something that you had to make profit. Okay? And that the more you could get, more houses you could get, the more you could trade, the more you could make, the more you could drive up the cost. Okay? And we had all sorts of problems as a result of that. And that's the key to understanding why we now have these crazy house prices that nobody can afford unless they're next to millionaires. And that we in Ireland had a very low rental market, very low, one of the lowest in the Western world. Now we're up with kind of the norm, except for public, like for social housing. The Western world generally, the percentage of houses that are social housing is about 20%. So 20% of all the houses in the country are social houses. In Ireland, it's 9%. So why are people surprised? Because what has happened is all the people who should be in the other 10 or 11%, they've all been driven into the private rental market. it's been so bad, they can't afford it, so the government has a program in which they spend billions every year subsidizing private rental. Okay? That basically is making it much tougher for people who are not eligible for the benefits that are the help to rent, and is driving them to have to rent at a higher price. So all you gotta do, simple solution, build social housing. Forget the rest of it, the rest will find its own way. Okay? What will happen if you build enough social housing? All the people who are currently working, getting subsidies to be in rental accommodation, and drop down into social and pay the going rate for whatever it is there, okay? That usually frees up a major part of the market in the rental sector. And that hopefully will bring down the price. Shouldn't bring down the price because if there's more or something, the price will down if you invest it in the price is. In that context, we also are living the fact that the IMF and the European Central Bank and the European Commission forced us to do a particular number of initiatives around rescuing banks after the crash. Now, the principal issue in the rescuing of the banks was that particularly the Germans, but others as well, the Americans, had lent huge amounts of money, gambled really, with renting or loaning money into Ireland's construction business that pulled their problem was they gambled on it and they lost because the whole thing crashed. So if you are gambling, you were gambling and you were putting your money on a racehorse and you went out and put your money on bet that it will win this race and the horse comes in last, okay? Now if you go back and look for your money back, what happens? You'll be laughed out of court. Be laughed out. What did Ireland do? We went along with the condition that the IMF, the European Central Bank and the European Commission did put on us, which was that we had to pay back 100% of the gambled money, particularly from the Germans, but also from the French and from others, including the US. Now that for me is robbery from the ordinary citizen, not from poor, definitely from the poor, but not just the poor, from the ordinary citizen. And one of the results is that the banks have a huge amount of their capital is in that borrowing that they get. And therefore, they have a vested interest in driving up the price of houses. And that's what's going on. Kind of a connection between policymakers, many of whom don't understand what they're involved in, and banks who know very well what they're involved in, and investors in those banks. And the result is, as always, in these kinds of situations, the better off, usually the banks are all back in the bank, out of the red and all that sort of stuff, okay? But who gets hit in the middle? Like middle income Irish people today are totally unable to go remotely close to purchasing house. Anybody knows that?
Hi, thank you so much. It's an honor to have you here and really appreciate everything. Your UBI has my head spinning. But one of the things we learned with COVID and people working from home and stuff like that. One of the first things employers here were willing to jump on right away for those who wanted to stay home and everything like that is adjustment in income based on location now that your expenses have gone down or that you didn't need to make enough money since you were living somewhere else. That was like the first thing. Sure, we'll let you stay home and work from home, but we're going to adjust. I mean, do you see a scenario where with something where everybody working or not, that employers would actually use this again as a key to say, okay, well, we already know they're taking in this amount of money. That's an adjustment to their income as far as we see it. So we shouldn't be paying them what we're paying them now. That's my first question.
That might be something that employers might be interested in doing. But remember, the situation is a bit different because people don't have to do that job. So what you're going to wind up with is a situation like the way you're outlining it, that employers were doing after the COVID time and so on, that's employers trying to increase their margin. Okay? But the people who had the job had no option a lot of the time. Whereas if you have a basic income, you do have an option. Okay. One, you can switch into a totally different area because you can work less or less time or whatever, or you can decide not to work at all for now, for this particular moment. Okay. So what I would say is that in a basic income situation, the real going rate for the job would prevail. An example. Why do we at this moment pay a lot more to people who mind our money than we do to people who mind our children?
Well, the people minding the children are getting, they make a lot of money too.
But they don't, yeah, there's no millionaires minding children,
Yeah.
like as their source of income that they have.
No, I know,
I'm
to say a
sure they're
lot of
minding their
people
own
are
children.
children minders can barely afford to have children minders because it almost costs as much as what you're.
I know,
paying.
but the issue, like, I mean, if you think in terms of precious or types of services for children, and I'm just using that as a simple
Yeah,
example.
yeah,
Why does a country like Ireland assume that looking after people with disability for the most part is the responsibility of the family and they must pay 100%? Is there nothing that we can sort of do in that space? Like the bottom line is, if we are doing a decent, a proper analysis, remember my ABC? If we actually are doing proper analysis to produce the aid, so we know exactly what's happening, part of that would be to tell us where the money will be going. So if we don't give it to somebody like who tries to work from home or whatever, and we won't do it, we send you less travel, so you don't need all this money or whatever. So we take it. Interesting. So, but if we had that type of stuff out there, we then see clearly where the money is going. Okay. And I think myself that if that type of approach produces a much more balanced outcome, particularly if there's some dialogue. So it's important maybe for some people to ensure that there's no dialogue, or to ensure that the understanding of the present reality is all wrong. They're not looked at all, or whatever. Why? Because they want to control access to a major part of life. Okay. I think we need a different approach. One of the things we are looking at, on our plan, we're going to find this out very quickly. That we have a situation where there won't be jobs for everybody. Just Peter mentioned, like I worked by staff. I was once parish priest of a pastor, as you say, of a parish that was 2,000 square miles. That had 49 churches. Now, maybe 4 or 5 of them were concrete bricks, and the rest were wood blocks and stuff. It was 2,000 square miles, 49 churches, and I was on my own, and there was no tar road, and there was only 20 people in that parish had a job. But everybody worked, everybody knew what everybody did, in the sense that this was their role and that was their role, and they did this, that, and the other, and the society functioned. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going back there at all, no. But I'm simply saying, it taught me a lesson. I was a young guy, I was 26 at the time. And it taught me something that I've never forgotten. That there may well be alternative ways of organizing ourselves that are far better for the vast majority, for the large majority of people. Not for everybody, particularly in the context that that I'm advocating, it might be as ways for millionaires and billionaires especially. Okay. Yeah. They're not my real experts.
Exactly. My other question was when you talked about the artist program and, you said that it was going well, or you felt it was going, could you elaborate on that? Like what makes it a success to date? What is it?
It's huge, powerful. If you just think about it, the way it works, okay? They opened up a program and they said, okay, anybody who wants a basic income, who's an artist, can apply. And they had all these categories for artists, but they were lucky because the society already had ways of categorizing people who were artists. So because there mightn't be an awful lot of artists make no money, or next to no money, okay? So they would be paid welfare, types of welfare, so they had a good idea, all right? Over 9,000 artists applied. And they were basically, if you qualify, they were athlete positions. Okay, so 3,000, there was a control group as well, who were paid a certain amount just to report it a few times. They got no basic income, but they were a comparable group, if you like, okay, just for research purposes. Now, the 3,000 got a payment of €325, which is maybe what, $360–70 a week, for 3 years. It's untaxed, and they can go and earn any money they like. That money, the money they earn through another job or something, is taxed. Now, they are conducting very detailed reviews of the responses of the artists, the impacts it has and all that sort of stuff. And they've published, a lot of that's been published already. They do, I think, quarterly or 6 monthly reports. They've all been very, very positive because they have improved everything from people's just capacity to sort of survive, to very good mental health impacts, to very good economic impacts on their own lives and stuff. Okay, so I don't think there's any doubt that will be very positive evaluated. The question then is, do they continue with it? They will come under a lot of pressure to do that. Personally, I'm very happy to see artists getting basic income. I would have been happier if they were paid the welfare rate, that amount of money as a basic income. Okay, I'd be happier. Why? Because then we'd be looking at whether something that could be applied across the whole society, make it universal. But government deliberately, I think, decided not to look at that. Okay, they created a pilot that can't be made universal. There's a start with universal, which is kind of typical of the policy basically. Okay, but I think myself, we have other ways of looking at this. One of these we're doing now. Okay, now I'm retired. I retired when I was 77. So I decided that was years after what, nearly 2 years. So, but the organization said one of the things we're doing now is campaigning and building a strong campaign so that the next group in society to get universal basic income will be carers.
Yeah.
Carers of the elderly, carers of children, carers of people with disabilities and so on. Okay, and that's a very solid component of our society. And if this is what it takes, then we only go through it one section of society, and the next section we eventually get there. Long after I'm gone, hopefully there'll be somebody still working on it to progress the time. Now, I'm not sort of ideologically tied to basic income, universal basic income as the solution. But I do believe that what I outlined in terms of society as problematic has to be addressed. And I have found no better means of doing it than universal basic income. Now, the World Bank has documented maybe over 1,000 pilots of basic income all over the place. Okay, one of the things that you find an awful lot, particularly in developed countries, is that the pilots get set up in such a way that they can't be made universal. And there's like over and over and over again. It's like there's a guiding hand warning government to do this in such a way that, okay, you will get good results, but make sure that it can't endanger the first. It seems to me that there's a vested interest in keeping, maintaining the status quo, but we drive that. And I think with all due respects, history is on our side.
Just before we put our hands together, Sean, I just want to hand over to my colleague, Marion, who's going to say a couple of words.
Thank you. I just want to, for those of you who don't know, the Irish Institute lecture is an endowed lecture, and it's intended to bring a speaker from Ireland to address contemporary issues. And Dr. Seán Healy has just delivered the 16th annual lecture in this series, and he has totally fulfilled the mission. Thank you very much.
And I'd like to reiterate that huge thanks to you, Sean, for your presentation and the questions and answers, and we invite everybody now to a reception downstairs, where hopefully we'll continue the discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.